Do I have any helpers helping me gather question cards? Do I have any question cards? I see some. Okay. I'll give you a few minutes. You taking them? I mean, you have some? Okay. Yes. Thank you. How are you, sir? You good?
They're upside down, right side up.
Okay. Okay, the only rule tonight is I'm answering questions about the comprehensive master plan. I will, of course, answer all questions, but if they don't relate to the comprehensive master plan, I'll put those to the side. Anyone else have cards? How much time do you want to spend on this? 15, 20, 30? You keep going until y'all start walking out? Okay, all right. Uh-oh. Hang on. Hang on. Good stuff. Thank you. Okay, this first one is going to be for my friends over here. What does the term incentivize mean, and what are the ramifications?
Well, incentivize is actually a new word, according to Webster's dictionary. I mean that slightly facetiously. A lot of people used that word before it became grammatically correct only a few years ago. But it means to leverage development, and we've used it several different ways in this presentation, so I'm not sure where the question was directed in terms of its use. But for example, if you want to attract or recruit development of a town center or businesses to the area, there are certain ways to do that. For example, by offering land at a lower cost than you would normally charge for that land. And that helps attract or recruit a developer who might be interested in developing because the land is at a lower cost. So that would be an example of an incentive that could be used to attract a developer.
Yeah, people have to have a reason to invest their money, so we need to give them a reason. This question, what do we do with a large amount of vacant retail space in the village, and how could we incentivize people to check out Hot Springs Village? So first, the vacant retail space. I'm going to let you guys talk a little bit about that, but I'll say when Matt was showing the bubbles of like Coronado and those places, those parts of the plan, that's what that was attempting to address. So do you guys want to talk about the large amount of vacant retail space?
Yeah, and it might not all be me on this one, but the first piece of this is, I've mentioned a number of times and in prior presentations some of the reasons why that space may be vacant, including not having, this time we talked a lot about not having a lot of people in close proximity, and that's one reason, but there's also the design of the spaces, the lease terms, and the maintenance of those buildings, but also their visibility from DeSoto and people's signage and people's ability to find those spaces. So there's a lot of issues that are stacked up against the existing retail spaces. We have talked a lot about new development and the opportunities where there is new development with those with retail spaces in them to allow for existing tenants to move from spaces that may not be particularly successful into spaces that are a little bit more successful. But one of the issues with the existing retail spaces is simply that they're out of date, and that's in a number of ways. And most retail spaces of that type have a 20-year lifespan, 25-year lifespan before they need massive renovation. Now, some of them can be renovated to be more successful, especially I think at the Westgate. You could see a lot more renovation of those spaces to be more successful. But some of the other spaces have other barriers. So, for instance, we've identified Carmona and as DeSoto as an important center that has a lot of opportunities, but a lot of the buildings that are there right now are not supportive of having visible and active retail and the housing that's adjacent to it that you need to support it. So in some places, redevelopment is probably the best answer. And that's the case in almost any place that we go. There's a lot of redevelopment of existing buildings that may be underperforming. They're also not particularly well suited in many cases to a variety of different tenants. The parking situation is a little bit specific to that tenant. So in some cases, redevelopment, in some cases, you can reface them in the meantime. But there are some other issues that have popped up where we've heard in terms of lease rates and maintenance that are a little bit more major. And what happens typically in other locations, mostly in cities and regions where we work outside of the area, you find that those spaces fall a bit into disrepair and then are purchased by somebody who redevelops them and puts in place more viable leasing terms and marketing strategies and so forth.
I just want to add one point to that, or 2 points rather. One is that there are sections within the plan on neighborhood revitalization or retail revitalization. So there are some strategic recommendations targeted to that question, and also some points about how the recreation amenities themselves can be used as a draw for getting more people to use the retail that's associated with them. So there's some points that are in the plan that address that specific question.
Thank you. So this card talks about the importance of broadband and Wi-Fi and cellular service, and makes the statement that the Governmental Affairs Committee is not followed through. And Mrs. Nally is on a board with the Public Service Commission. 2 things. First, I'm not on a Public Service Commission board. And, I have to give it to our Governmental Affairs Committee. That's a difficult conversation. That requires that investment that I mentioned earlier, either by us or by the provider. And unfortunately, if there is not enough return on that investment, the provider won't make the investment. So then we have to make the choice. That may be a service or amenity we wish to subsidize or that we wish to staff in-house. So it's not fully within our control unless we're willing to take a few steps. Although I will tell you, Greg Jones is on our Governmental Affairs Committee. He's been working diligently, has been meeting with all of the executives and the people that can make that happen. And bottom line, it comes down to a return for the providers. So we'll continue to work with them. There comes that incentivize comment again. We'll continue to, that's one of the reasons why I really like this comprehensive master plan, because now we can put this document in front of them. And we can say, we are taking charge of our future. We are taking charge of our growth. And yes, you should invest in Hot Springs Village. I know it's important, and we'll keep going.
Leslie.
No, go right ahead.
I'd like to just add something to that.
Yeah,
and
go
that
right ahead, John.
I think that it's important that you look at improving Wi-Fi in the village as an investment, not an expense. And I think, and I say that because, as I said earlier, a lot of seniors use the internet and are quite adept at it. And in fact, the people that are likely to come here are going to see it as, for you, the price of entry.
Most definitely. Very good point. Go right ahead, Matt. Yes.
And just in terms of the physical implications, one of the reasons that you have a hard time getting it is because of the dispersal of your housing. Because you don't have concentration of housing, which then they see, the providers see as something they can get a return on. And, that's fine, and that's the situation, but that means that they're probably not likely to, they're not going to be the first ones out of the gate to give you service, or to easily give you service. Now, some are converting to cellular service and more wireless-based services, but those are still limited, and they're not necessarily rolling out in the area, again, because of the the cost it takes for them to put up equipment on towers and the population density that they have of people to pay for their services. So it's really something you have to think about strongly in terms of your abilities to provide internally, because you have the capacity. All the capacity that you need in the world is right there on DeSoto. It's tapping into that capacity. That's the hard part, and it's not likely that some of the other big providers are going to do that for you.
Very good point. Okay, so this question is, what are the plans to attract major developers to Hot Springs Village? I'll start, and if you guys have anything to add. First was to complete this comprehensive master plan and be able to give them some specific ways that we intend to develop. Matt talked about that zoning document. That's so important in providing that predictability that is needed for someone to come and invest their money in development here. There were discussions about RFPs and tools. There's lots of tools within the plan that will help us to do that recruitment. So, and also to identify who those people might be and things like that. So I don't know if any of you want to add to that, but those are our plans. That is one of the immediate next steps. I believe Stephanie was on your list, and we know that's needed.
I'll just double up on the zoning document. It's very, very important, and we are rewriting zoning codes across the country because the old codes have gotten in the way of development, and the lack of predictability gets in the way of development. And right now, even though there are powers in the declarations and covenants to allow change to happen, because there's not a clear set of rules, submittals, objectivity, and an understanding of how to appeal reviews and so forth, because the process isn't clear, it's going to be very hard to get somebody to be willing to risk their money on something that they don't have an idea of what either the vision is or their process to get through development submittals. So actually putting these things together, both the vision and a code together that allows you to implement a vision, is very, very, very important in encouraging development.
Good point.
I'll just mention one thing briefly,
yeah.
and that is the town center, the mixed-use concept that we've been talking about over and over. If you were to try to build that in Little Rock, it's against the law. It's not in the codes. You can't do it. And so developers in our region might say, hey, this is a trend we're seeing across the country. We want to do one of these. There are certain cities that the codes just don't work because they've never been updated. You all are going to be really trend-setting because now your new codes are going to allow for everything that's happening in the country with regard to pocket neighborhoods, density, walkability, all the things that developers are keying in on. So one of the things you'll do is, as a group, and there's action items and people assigned to it, you can do some research and figure out who has the type of development that you want and who built it, and attract them.
Just there's also the diversification of the types of lots that you have, the types of housing products that you can have built within the village. And right now, the vast majority of all of your houses are of one type. And we'd reviewed this before. Those suffice for about 30% of total demand. So 70% of demand in the market is aiming for something that you can't provide. So by both enlarging properties in some areas and allowing for replatting of properties to fit the products that the market is looking for will help you to encourage development.
John, you wanted to add something?
Sure, I'll try and make this brief. I've worked for the last 15 years with another gentleman, and we have done several dozen plans for downtown redevelopment, including revitalization of town centers. And before we got to working together, this gentleman went to work for a large community on the coast in Oregon, in Washington State, near the Oregon border. And he recruited $2.5 billion worth of investment into that community, and his advertising budget was $65. And the point I'm making here is this is a hands-on, you figure out what you want, you show them that you have skin in the game, you show them what you want developed, not leaving everything up to them. You go and you talk to them and you negotiate, you incentivize, you do whatever you have to do. But this is a one-on-one business. and a hands-on business. And you'll get it that way. You won't get it by advertising for people to come and invest here.
Excellent point. Excellent point. This says, when you give us 5 buckets and we vote by show of hands, it is too high level. For example, do culvert repairs fit underwater or roads? Similarly, much of the shred and town hall meeting is so high level, almost canned or boilerplate. We can't make choices based on show of hands. I would agree. It is one tool that we use, though, to gauge what the consensus is just in the room, just to give us an idea of what the consensus is. So we're going to use lots of tools, and I can assure you when you read through this 500-page document that you will find it's anything but boilerplate, but we'll continue to fine-tune and boil down all of these complex questions. Is the comprehensive master plan feedback the reason for paid employees replacing volunteers, or why are we doing it? So today in the paper, you may have seen an article about how many volunteers and employees we have today versus how many we had 12 years ago. We actually have fewer employees and more volunteers. So the facts don't support that we have less volunteers and more employees. What we have done, though, is redistributed, I guess you could say, our resources to begin to align around our comprehensive master plan. And every company does that, and every community does that every year. I mean, that's what you should do. Where are we in the history of what we need to accomplish, and what are the resources that we need? You heard these guys talk about, and you'll see in the plan, some additional committees that they actually recommend. So we'll continue to work on that. Will the comprehensive master plan on the website have built-in links within the document to facilitate ease of use? We are working on the linkage just for the major sections. And yes, we know it would be very difficult to kind of pull up 500 pages. Okay. Still ready for me to go on? I see some of you getting up. Okay.
Hey, Leslie, while you're looking at the next one, I do want to mention that I don't think it was mentioned before. Where you find the link to review that plan, you'll also find an email address for comments. So if it's something that you think later on, especially when you're reviewing it, you say, oh, I wish I could ask this or suggest that, everyone's going to use that link, that email address to give those comments. They're going to collect them all and be able to get those to us so we can help address it.
Excellent point. Thank you. Yes. Yeah, remember what Stephanie said. This deep dive that we're going to do between now and the board meeting is that process that Stephanie described, and we want to hear from you, all your questions. So what is the projected cost of the wayfinding signage as shown on the slides based on real-time development estimates in the development cost-benefit tool? Any idea, John, on the estimates of the signage?
Well, typically, when we have done wayfinding systems for destinations, for communities, it's phased in. And so you don't have the full cost in any one year. But I can give you some ideas. For a community the size of this size, and without going into every street sign, but in terms of doing the major signs, the first thing you need to do is have it designed. And when it's designed, it's done to bid-ready specs so that you can put it out to bid to a design maker. And so you can spend an inordinate amount of money if you want to go to the Cadillac version, or you can make it very simple. And typically, with materials and everything, it's best for you to have a budget in mind and then build the sign system to the budget rather than do it the other way around. Having a person work with you to design, do the messaging and location of the major signs is going to be, for a community like this, probably about $80,000 just to get all the specs done. then to build the signs usually run between, for a major sign like I showed on the screen, they usually run from $4,000 to $7,000 a piece, and you can make them less expensive, but that's about average what the communities we work with spend on signs.
Yeah, I noticed that Bella Vista just did that, or just did that. Anybody been to Bella Vista recently? Yeah, they just did a major in theirs. Did you have something to say, Dave?
I was just going to say, please don't run your car into those once they're installed, because they're not cheap to replace.
Actually,
sure.
Yeah, and they do have breakaway at the foundation, so if you run into them, they fall over.
For all of us that are, yes. Okay, so there you go. We have a new generation coming up behind us who are not the golfers that we are. What is included in the new plan that will attract them? Would one of you guys like to talk about that? I can think of a couple of things off the top of my head. The trail system that was discussed, the connectivity of that, the walkability of that, just some of the ways that the town center was looked at. Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, I was going to mention that, about 4 or 5 years ago, Golf Digest finally said we don't have the crown anymore, that the generations that are coming up have taken over the number one business and social sport, and it's cycling. And I know you all have an event that cycles in each year, the MS 150, but in the plan, we have identified both on-road and off-road cycling, as well as suggestions for mountain bike. In Hot Springs, there are 2 epic mountain bike trails just right near here. Epic meaning the best in the country. Arkansas has 5, and the only state, Colorado is the only one that has more, and it's 6. So there's that. I mean, there's a trail network, whether it's hiking or biking, or there's also things that are going to happen in the future that we can't predict. Let's say 10 years from now, there's something that's really going to be big for the 40-year-olds when I'm 65 or something. So we have those tools in there, and those tools will allow you to evaluate the value of whatever that is, even if it doesn't have a name right now. So you can say, do we own the land? How many people in the community are going to use it? Will it generate revenue? All those different things, so that you can still use that tool 20 years from now when something becomes the new trend.
Go ahead, Randall.
Yeah, I just want to say 2 quick things. One is that I think the trails and all of that build on your existing natural assets. And the natural assets are really at the heart, I think, of what you're selling here is really the beauty, the natural beauty. You are the natural state. You have all of the beauty here wrapped into one beautiful area. And so using those assets to begin with has to be key to a lot of your recreation strategy. So you have the lakes, the trails, and the mountain vistas, that sort of thing. The other thing is that before people start nailing the nails in the coffin of the golf market, I know that there is sort of a little bit of a turnaround in terms of participation rates among the younger generations. So while participation rates have been declining for some time now, there is a little bit of a change, a little bit in some of the younger people who are going back to the golf course. So we'll see what will happen in the next few years.
Excellent point.
But one more, which is, I mean, you mentioned quickly the centers, but really and the centers beyond just mixed use and technical things that we've been talking about, it's really the visible and tactile sense of community by having people engaging with each other together in spaces. And actually you do a great job already of having outdoor activities, but they're not connected, they're hidden away in the back. And so a lot of pulling those things out front and connecting them with housing and connecting them with other social activities together, that drives the sort of experience that a lot of people are now looking for, and that new trends are heading towards.
In the section on the town center, there is a list I put in there of a long list of outdoor events, activities, and things that are typical of communities like yours that they can and should undertake. So,
Covered pickleball. We heard you. What? Okay, you didn't bring your is it racket? Is that the right term? Okay.
But you have to have internet. We all know that.
Okay. Still have time for a few more? Okay. All right. When will DeSoto be widened to 4 lanes? None of this is feasible until this is done. Valid question.
Okay.
This is actually in the plan, although maybe not the way you describe it. Go ahead.
Yeah, I probably won't cover everything that's in the plan as it relates to DeSoto. The good thing is that you didn't build out, because if you did, DeSoto wouldn't work at all. What you can do in the meantime, so there's a lot of difficulties in expanding DeSoto, especially because of the grades of the road, and you have a lot of cases where you have to have a lot of embankment, and you don't have the ability to expand that embankment. Additionally, there's the Joyride hill that I measured today it's 20% grade, which is insane.
It's our new amenity.
So there's a lot of issues there. So a few things. The first thing is that you need to look at the intersections on DeSoto. Making improvements at the intersections is key. Now there's a whole bunch of different types of intersection improvements that may be plausible. We've listed some initial examples and thoughts in the CMP. They all require study, but a lot of issues with traffic come out of the ability to make left turns and backing up on roads that you want to turn left onto DeSoto or turning left from DeSoto onto other streets, and it's really not provided for right now. And so those can be handled in a number of ways. You can have roundabouts on the high end. You can get to having stop control. You can have left turn lanes where it's justified. And there's a series of ways to handle that. And I think each intersection needs to be looked at on a case-by-case basis to see what's possible. And in a lot of cases, you're actually limited by the geometry of DeSoto, because it takes a curve that's pretty sharp, and then you have an intersection. And that doesn't provide you enough space to make major changes in how that intersection functions. So it's complicated. But we've made some recommendations there. The other is with the town center development, this portion we have anticipated that for a portion of DeSoto that's about a quarter mile long, that you would have to do 4 lanes there. And this is a place where there's not a lot of topography to get in the way. We talked briefly with the power utility, and they said they could underground the lines. So there's not a lot that keeps you from doing it, and that would be something that would be incumbent upon the development of the town center in the financing of that entire project to pay for. But essentially what that does is it mitigates right turns and left turns into and out of that area. But then lastly is trip capture. And this is capturing trips within the gates that would otherwise pass through the gates or along DeSoto. So if you can create activities in the town center and Carmona and Colella and be able to provide for people's needs in those places, then you actually reduce traffic overall. So it's a combination of a number of different issues together. But the reality is you can't go to 4 lanes maybe ever, just because the geometry and topography doesn't allow you to do so.
Is anyone else impressed by that? I mean, 5 months. And this, I mean, thank you. Okay. How will property owners near areas to be developed be engaged in the process in a way that allows them to protect their investment? Excellent question, because I know if development happens near my house, I want to know about it and I want to have input into it. So there's several ways that will happen. I think the plan talks about notices, talks about, I don't know if it calls it focus groups or do you remember that part, Matt? Am I making this up in my head?
Well, it's part of the code actually in the end. So
that's right. Okay.
So what the code does, if you look at the declarations right now, they'll say that you can replat, and the ACC should give recommendations to the board, and the board would be the approval body. But it says it in like a sentence. So what we've done is put together a process and procedures section in the zoning code that spells out all the pieces in that notice to residents surrounding and so forth. But there's basically, to simplify it, we said there's 3 levels of review and approval. One are the minor things that staff can do, like if somebody's going to make an adjustment on their fence or something, really small things that doesn't need to take the time of ACC. Then there's the next level, level 2, which are things that need to go up to the ACC. So we'll specify in the code, and you can comment on the code, the regulations much more specifically than you have right now, though covering a lot of things that are already covered. And if someone wants to violate those, then that goes to the ACC, who has, I believe their meetings are open and recorded, and so, or at least there's a written record.
Yes, that is correct.
Yeah, and so therefore those sorts of items that would therefore violate the standards go to the ACC. Anything that has to do with replatting, that has to do with a pocket neighborhood or an activity center or anything like that, that goes to level 3, which is board approval, and that requires notice of residents. And there's a long timeline. Documents need to be submitted a month in advance so that residents can review them. So we've pulled all these together into the processes and procedures and really clarified it, both so the developer knows what's going on, but also so you have transparency and you know where to engage, and you know when projects will bump up to the ACC level or the board level and be able to weigh in on those.
Very good. It's about a 100-page document that he's describing that's pretty in-depth. So we're still good for a few more questions? Okay. How does the CMP address transportation of the aging population when they can't drive for day-to-day activities, medical appointments, or too dangerous to be driving? There's a section at the end that we briefly mentioned, and it's the service gaps section of our comprehensive master plan. Transportation is specifically one of the items, in addition to broadband, in addition to things like recycling and things like that. Specifically, what needs to be done is there were several recommendations, I think, in that section talking about expanded use of our existing program, right? Uber. There's 2 or 3 things, but there's an actual page you'll see almost at the very end of the plan that addresses that transportation.
I can review very quickly. Yeah. One item is to allow for aging in the community into locations that may not require so much driving. That may not be for everybody, but that's an option and something that that the plan would provide for. Another is, as Leslie said, the expansion or finding ways to get additional funding for programs that you already have. And then she mentioned quickly Uber, which you don't have, but we reached out to them and they have a product that with, if you wanted it, you could actually develop the ability to have Uber in the community. And you do that by, one, training people to be drivers that are in the community. Well, another is not to require them to register as home businesses. And then 2, when you do that, there's the ability for the POA or anybody else, this could be done by a private organization too, to have a dashboard. They have a dashboard now that you can even take phone calls for somebody and arrange a ride. And by doing that, you basically have a sort of a call taxi service, but instead of running a taxi service, the back end is managed by Uber. And so anyone else who wants to use that on their own, on their smartphone, uses the same pool of drivers. So overall, as a community, you build up the opportunity to do that. And you might roll something like that out in some community events, like you have theater events here, and you find ways ahead of time to market that service to your residents.
Good point. Okay, the CMP stresses the need for financial centers to support Hot Springs Village. It seems that there will need to be more support from people living outside. Does the CMP include opening these centers to non-residents? If so, how is that being addressed? So I would say that most of you are driving out of here every day, going somewhere else, just to kind of make things easier, and then I'll let my friends answer part of this. But most of you are driving out of here every day, going somewhere else, and there are 14,000 of you here at any given time, plus when we have our season. We already have enough people inside the village to support centers, as long as those centers contain the things that are needed, right? That's the key. They have to actually fill the need. So one of the things that you'll see in the plan when you read about the town center, it does make the statement that if we chose, that we could kind of take two paths on that. We could actually choose to create another manned or staffed gate near Danville. Do I have this right? Yeah, Danville Gate. Actually, do another staffed gate there and allow for entry into the town center. Of course, there's some issues about how do we make sure that the lakes and other things are protected. But I guess there are a couple of different ways to do that. And the first and foremost is that we'd like to provide the services that you need and that our visitors need. So I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Randall?
Yeah, I mean, that's basically the point. But also I would add that as you build more housing in these centers, especially in the town center, you're adding to the number of rooftops and income that are available to support retailers. So, as well as visitors, if you have tournaments and you have a conference center, that type of thing. So those additional householders or visitors help generate demand for retail and services that support the kinds of things that you may want now that a retailer might not come in for. So I think it's all part of a package. It's not just about retail, but it's about the housing and the mixed use as part of one big package.
Excellent point. Excellent point. That's why we need a comprehensive plan. This is a statement, but I'm going to go ahead and read it because I want to acknowledge it. It appears that explorethevillage.com will be easily confused with the villages in Florida. I haven't paid much attention to the villages in Florida site lately, but I'll certainly take a look at that. I didn't know that there were any similarities, but I'll take a look at that. Were the marketing studies you used based on families in the Midwest, or were they coast to coast? The marketing studies you used.
Well, there were two. One's housing. One is retail.
Mm-hmm.
Or three.
There were three market studies that had been done previous to this comprehensive plan. One by three different consultants. One was a hotel study. One was a retail study, and one was a housing study. And they looked specifically at the market here at this location. Now, the retail study was fairly focused in one particular location for retail, but they generally focused on Hot Springs Village. They didn't look at markets somewhere else in the country, from what I could tell.
Good point. Go ahead, Matt.
I would just add that if there's concern on the housing side because you're drawing people from a wider area than the local area, that recently the state of Michigan had a housing study done for basically the entire state, which is crazy, but they did it. And the study found relatively similar results to the study that was done here in 2014. Not exactly the same percentage here and there, but in general what it found is that the supply of a certain type of product is far above the demand for that product, and there's a lot of other housing products that are not being provided for. And in essence, that's the result of the study that was done in 2014 here locally, but it reflects the Michigan study, but also a trend that we've seen in all of our projects that are across the country.
Thank you. Okay, we're still doing okay? Okay. What services and or facilities will the CMP suspend? I don't know of a service or facility we've specifically identified. We've only given the tools that perhaps as we go through the development and as we do our budgeting process, that we use those tools to decide things like how many people use them, is it still worth subsidizing at the level, things like that. So maybe that'll come up a little more in the budgeting process later in the year. You have something to add, Matt?
Yeah, for the most part, the suspension is aimed at infrastructure and your growing infrastructure operations and maintenance liabilities to cut off those liabilities. Just in 20 years, you've got enough work to do with that to try to rein in your liabilities. So we're finding locations to look at for that require some further study with Public Works.
I guess one example, though, would be the discussion on the Balboa building. And on one of the slides, there was an either-or scenario. Do a study, a structural soundness study, to make sure, should it actually be redeveloped as it is today, or should that building come down? So that might be one example I don't know, Stephanie, are there others? But that one comes to mind as, okay. What do studies show for working families that would entice them to live in the village and commute to communities outside the village? So, do we still have anyone in the room who lives here but works somewhere else? Okay, you and you. Okay, so so people are doing that. People are also they're also working from home. I know a couple that do some things from home. So I haven't actually done a study per se. Randall, you have something to add?
There are some recommendations that are specific to sort of workforce development, and part of that is housing for people, especially I know there was an issue identified early on about staff of the POA and where they can live and where they can afford to live and that sort of thing. When you have services, when you have retail, where are those workers going to live? And so there are specific recommendations on the housing side of that question in terms of upgrading of existing rental units, for example, creating incentives for developers to include workforce housing, those types of things that help create some housing resources for people who might be working here or elsewhere, but that are especially needed within the community.
Excellent. Okay. All right, from Facebook Live. Thank you, Facebook Live. What assurance do we, the property owners, have that future POA boards will continue to adhere to the Comprehensive Master Plan and use the tools, policies, and procedures? Yeah, that's a good question.
Well, I only have it on the zoning side. I don't necessarily have it on.
Thank you for giving me time to think about this.
On the tools side, but on the zoning side, with that set of codes, we're also setting a procedure for modifications to those codes. So one, you have to use them, and that's part of the policy documents and adopted that way. So those set forth how decisions are made and notice and so forth, like we already discussed, but also how and when modifications can be made to that document. So you can't just sort of tomorrow in a back room change that without a vote.
That's a good point. I would add too that typically with plans, once they're adopted, the community pretty well pushes forward the plan. Because they're invested and are vested in the plan, and they want to continue to improve the value of their property. And although it may, ebb and flow a little over time, the plan moves forward. Did you have something?
Yeah, I did have something. I just wanted to say it is you all that will hold the leaders' feet to the fire. Just looking at the number of people, not what's left, but what we had earlier, we don't typically get that in some communities. We did the comprehensive plan for Maumelle. We didn't get the kind of turnouts that you all did at the charrette and at this final meeting. And so when communities are invested in their future and they participate in the process, we find those communities move it forward because we know that mayors or leaders sometimes might cycle through, especially mayors, every 4 years or every 8 years. But that document is intended to go beyond those current leaders. And so the participation, I think, is commendable on your side.
And especially what Dave showed at the end, which is a series of recommendations and steps and timelines and responsibilities that allows you to further hold their feet to the fire to ensure that they're happening, and you can see, you can ensure that those topics are being covered and that things are moving forward. You have the ability to hold to account the activities that are being done.
And it doesn't have a person's name; it has a position. So let's just say Leslie says, you know what, this is awesome, and I'm going to retire and enjoy my lake view tomorrow. That's okay, because whoever you interview, you put this document in front of them, and you say, by the way, here are your new duties over the next 10 years. It tells them exactly what it is expected from them. So it's kind of a roadmap for everyone.
And I can tell you, I would have loved, and I'm sure our, current board and probably other boards would have loved to have had that roadmap and those list of priorities and strategies to say, okay, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We don't have to just talk about individual projects, but we can actually continue this long-term vision. Okay, don't we already have signs designating various Hot Springs Village amenities, including mileage to them? I would say we do have some, but as someone who just moved here a year ago, I still don't know where I am half the time, except on DeSoto. It's very difficult when you're not from here. When you're from here, you tend to know where you're going, and when you're not, it makes it very difficult. So I know you've spent a lot of time, John, looking at our signage, and you just mentioned you got lost quite a bit. Would you say there anything in particular that you found that was missing that rose to the top of mind?
I would say certainly when I first came here, I had no idea of the number of retail stores in little pockets or restaurants in little pockets that were off the main road, hidden by pine trees, and not lit at night. You couldn't see them. You couldn't find them because of no signage. So,
Yeah,
and you can drive from west to east and count the years of how the signs changed over the years. You know,
the inconsistency.
There's
of the
there's an
signs.
inconsistency too,
Definitely.
and like I said, first impressions are lasting impressions.
Definitely. We're still good, right? What kind of outside support will the POA need to implement the CMP, and how much will it cost us? We'll need a lot of outside support. We'll need a lot of investors and developers and community partners. How much will it cost us? It depends on the things that we agree are our priorities. I wish I had the magic bullet to say it's going to cost us X amount and we can do it in 4 years. This is a long-term plan. So, Dave, you want to add to that?
And just remember, whatever that cost might be up front, and it could be in land, it could be in time, staff time, whatever that cost is an investment that you're going to recoup as profits. So let's say you attract a developer and you're going to give some land and you're going to do your due diligence with lease agreements. In the long run, you're going to be reaping the rewards over and over for year after year. So that front-end cost in most cases is going to be minimal based on your profits.
But there are key important things, other questions that have been brought up today, like DeSoto, for example. What do we do to improve conditions there? And that requires some study by an engineer, a traffic engineer, that will study those intersections, for example. So there are necessary costs going forward for some. I don't think that by this we're creating any sort of new outside costs that weren't always already there or you didn't already need to undertake. We're just sort of collecting them and putting them in one place so you know on the path forward. And I think we've identified even in the strategies in a lot of cases where they have outside requirements.
Okay, it's 10 after 8. What I'm going to do is take 2 more questions, and then I'll complete these questions and we'll send them out online. That be okay? Okay, 2 more questions. All right. Assuming the plan is implemented, who will take responsibility and be held accountable if all of this fails? You know what? I think we all are responsible if all of this fails. And I'll be the first to take the responsibility, though. That's my simple answer. My longer answer than that is, I don't believe that it will fail. If it... And the reason I say that is, if we embark on this as a shared vision, then why would we let it fail? Why wouldn't we use the tools that we developed and prioritize and decide as a community how we move? Why would we let that happen? Whether it's me or anyone else standing here or this board or a board 5 years from now, I just don't think we should do that. This community deserves more than that.
I think the appropriate answer would be, if you don't do this, your community will fail.
Didn't want to go there, Dave, but you're right.
Well, and because we know you have maintenance of roads and utilities that's over 40 years old and it's spread out over 26,000 acres, and you don't want to increase your assessments over and over and over and over to pay for all of it, you can't. You just really can't. And so you really can't afford not to do it.
I just wanted to add that, just as a caveat, and I think I've mentioned to this before, that keep your eye on the prize in terms of the long term, because there are real estate cycles, as we all know. So there may be a period where you've done some investment, you've tried to attract development or whatever, and the nation goes through a real estate recession, but it'll come out and you've made that investment. So you have to keep going and moving forward. So I'm just putting that caveat on there so that you're not surprised if something doesn't happen in a certain time.
That's true, because if we all knew the future, we would all be really rich. We wouldn't be sitting here. We would be somewhere sailing around the world together. Okay. Okay. Not enough time for deep dive. I'll end on this one. There's not enough time for deep dive. We need public input. Why wasn't there enough time? I can tell you that Stephanie and I spent all weekend reading all 500 pages. A comprehensive master plan, there's not enough time to do that standing here unless you guys are willing to stand here with us for about 3 days. Is that what it took us? Yeah. It's a pretty complex document. So what we've attempted to do today is hit on the points that we thought were most important to you and then make the full document available. We will also be doing like a white paper later in the process to summarize again. Tonight was an overview. Then we're going to give you all of the details. We're going to ask for your input along the way. As Dave mentioned, there's going to be an email address. So as you're reading and making notes, shoot your emails. We want to hear from you. That's the public input process. This is the time for public input. Don't forget, you also had time for public input in the charrette process. So we're closing in. It's not like this is the end-all, be-all. Remember what I said. This is not the end. This is the ribbon-cutting ceremony for our next few years. Anything to add? With that, I want to thank you all for being here. Thank you for investing in your community, and I look forward to moving forward together with you.